I'm Ken Ackerman, and Pete and Mayor Koch were nice enough to let me go first and get things started. I wrote a book that was published last year called Boss Tweed, The Corrupt Pol Who Conceived the Soul of Modern New York. And I'll just talk for a couple of minutes about why, as a biographer, I found Tweed attractive as a public figure to write about. And then I'll give you some quick biography facts so that you can place him in history and know who he is. My wife doesn't like it when I use this example, but when you write a biography, it's almost like being married to the person you're writing about for a year to a year and a half. You spend a lot of time with them. You get to know them in a very intimate way. For me and Boss Tweed, we spent a lot of time together. I got to read his personal mail. I went through his personal checkbooks. I read his testimony. I found out all about which of his grandkids got into trouble. I got to know him in a way that few people did. And to write a biography, to spend that much time with someone, there has to be something about them that appeals to you. You don't necessarily have to like them. Boss Tweed was a criminal, that goes without saying. But there has to be something that draws you in. And usually it's something that about the person that doesn't quite make sense, doesn't quite add up, that you feel you have to figure out. And with Boss Tweed, it's something very glaring. On the one hand, it's easy to make the case that William Magier Tweed, that's his proper name, Magier, was easily the single most corrupt politician who ever served on American soil, bar none. The sheer amount of graft that he and his circle took while they were in power in New York City from the late 1860s to the early 1870s has been estimated as at least $45 million. Some of the estimates go up to $100 to $200 million. Now, those are $1870. In modern money, that is billions. Quite simply, no one has ever stolen that much from any level of government in our country, except for them. When Boss Tweed would steal an election, he wouldn't simply stuff a ballot box or two. He would overwhelm it. In 1868, the year that he consolidated power in New York City and New York State, out of about 156,000 ballots cast in New York City that year, a congressional investigating committee found that about a third, about 50,000, were either fake or fraudulent. That came from many sources. There were repeat voters, people, groups voting 10, 20, 40, 50 times each, going in organized gangs of several dozen men from polling place to polling place. Often they had deputy sheriffs going with them, protecting them, so that if a Republican poll watcher would try to challenge one of the voters, the poll watcher would be arrested and they could vote. That year, Tweed and his organization naturalized about 40,000 recent Irish immigrants as citizens in the weeks before Election Day. One courtroom, one judge named George Barnard had a system in his court where literally 20 or 30 new immigrants would elbow their way in to put their hand on a Bible at the same time to take the oath of citizenship. Often, most of those people did not speak English. They didn't know what they were swearing to. They didn't know there was a residency requirement. Many of them were outright imposters. The next year, the mayor, Opie Hall, may have been up. It's not clear, but Tweed didn't want to take any chances. The day before Election Day, he declared an election for mayor. That afternoon, all the police put ballot boxes in all the local jurisdictions for people to vote. There was only one ballot. Opie Hall got 66,000 votes. Everyone else got 151. That's the way Tweed ran things. Now, by the time Tweed died, none of this was a secret. It was common knowledge. It was disclosed in the newspapers. He was convicted in court. He confessed it all. He spent several days before an all-Germanic committee and gave a full confession of how he bribed the state legislature, skimmed the city treasury, stuffed the ballot boxes, and still, today, 130 years later, New York City celebrates Boss Tweed through events like this, which all of you were nice enough to come out for, and also by putting his name on, of all things, the county courthouse. The Tweed Courthouse, that building down in City Hall Park, which was recently renovated for almost $100 million, that bears his name. It's not the official name, but there is a gold plaque on the building calling it the Tweed Courthouse. Normally, you name the courthouse for a famous judge or a famous lawyer, or sometimes for the congressman who gets the pork barrel money to build the building. William Maguire Tweed was convicted on 204 counts of misdemeanor fraud in that courthouse. He was sentenced to 12 years in jail on Blackwell's Island. That's what they used to call Roosevelt Island, which is where the prison was. And he died in jail a broken man. Not the profile of someone you name a court after. Even in America, where we tend to glamorize criminals, Jesse James, for instance, is a folk hero in much of the heartland, but you don't see anyone naming banks after him. The fact is that Boss Tweed, during his lifetime and after his death, was extremely popular. When he had political rallies, he would draw crowds of tens of thousands of people. His largest one in October of 1870 was estimated to have drawn between 40 and 100,000 people. Great events, torchlight parades with brass bands and fireworks. The fact was that there was a reason Tweed was so popular. He and his circle did more to build the city of New York, more to bring working people and immigrants into the social mainstream than anyone else of their generation. It was their group that paved the streets and laid the sidewalks and dug the sewers all around this part of town. The Upper West Side, the Upper East Side, Midtown. Their fingerprints are on every major institution of that era. Central Park, the New York Stock Exchange, Mount Sinai's Hospital, several others. They named streets after him. There was a Tweed Plaza. It's now the tip of Seward Park in Lower Manhattan. By the time the New York Times and Thomas Nast Harper's Weekly were railing against him for almost a year, claiming corruption, people didn't believe it. People didn't want to believe it because things worked so well under him. Now, that's why he appealed to me. A few very quick facts about him as a person. Tweed was born in the 1820s in New York City. He lived in New York all of his life. His full name, as I mentioned, was William Maguire Tweed, not William Marcy. That's a creation of the newspapers. He was Protestant, not Catholic. He was the third generation of Tweeds born in America. His family traces its history to a little town called Kelso on the River Tweed in Scotland. His father was a chairmaker. He wasn't very rich, but he also wasn't poor. He grew up on Cherry Street next to the East River in Lower Manhattan. Tweed was a big, tough kid, oversized, good in a fight, in good physical shape. Later on, people tried to describe him as coarse and uneducated, and that simply isn't the truth. He spent a year in public school, the school on Christie Street. He spent a year in a boarding school in in New Jersey. He was very good at math and accounting. His father brought him in useful skills for the future. His father made him an apprentice in his business. He headed a street gang on Cherry Street when he was growing up. He joined the New York Fire Department as a volunteer fireman, which helped him launch his political career, both because it gave him a network of friends in the neighborhood, but also because politics back then in the 1840s and 1850s was a pretty tough affair. If there was a tussle in Tammany Hall over a nomination, some other candidate might bring the Dead Rabbits or the Bowery Boys. Tweed would bring the New York Fire Department, and they could hold their own with anyone. He started out in business as a brushmaker. Tammany Hall approached him in the 1840s. He joined the New York City Aldermen, a group called the 40 Thieves, before he even got there. He spent one term in the United States Congress. It's not something you normally picture with him. But Washington, Congress back then was a place where you sent people to get them out of the way for a few years. Tweed was bored to death. A few years later, they asked him if he wanted to go back as a senator, and he said, "What for? I can't talk, and I know it, and to hear a bunch of old snoozers argue about the tariff and every particular of moving the mails from Schoharie to Paducah is not for me." He rose through the ranks of Tammany. He became a school supervisor, a city supervisor, a deputy street commissioner, and finally head of Tammany Hall. By the time he reached his apex in 1868, he held 3 major jobs: a state senator, public works